Thank you very much for coming back so promptly from the well-deserved coffee break. One of the key parts of the Draghi report was innovation. So I think the organizers did really well to put the dedicated panel on that question, not just because the ultimate driver of economic growth is innovation, but also because it increasingly has aspects of economic security, technological leadership, and sort of making Europe safer in what is now a truly dangerous world. And we want to focus on how innovation works, what can be done to foster it, what is the state's role in all of this, and of course also what the EU can do continent-wide. The national security and defense aspects of innovation, I will try to leave out here because we have a dedicated panel on defense later, and there inevitably we will also talk about defense and innovation. Now with me on the panel are Oliver FALCK, all the way on my left. He is from the Institut, who leads their center on IO, International Organization, and New Technologies. Also on AI and its effects on jobs, such as those of journalists. Then we have Daniel GROS to my left. Well, do I need to introduce you at all? So the former director of CEPS here in Brussels, now with Bocconi, the Swiss Army knife of European policy analysis, if I may. That's what it says on your LinkedIn, right? Then we have Keith SEQUEIRA from the EU Commission, just next to Oliver over there. He has worked on the design of research and innovation programs in the EU before. Be careful though, if you do end up Googling his name, he's not the model and actor by the same name. He has a background in physics. Then we have Reinhilde VEUGELERS from the KU Leuven, and Bruegel, a well-known expert on innovation here in the city. And she has worked on, among others, like pharma, so one sector where Europe still excels, so maybe there's a bit of optimism in there. We shall see. And then we have Andreas Sabi in the middle, who represents disruptive progress made in Germany, which, as we know, is badly needed to get away from the diesel engine. He is an innovation manager at Germany's version of America's ARPA, which we call Sprint with a D at the end, but it's a similar idea. A state agency that funds disruptive innovation. Now that's a panel, right? I will divide this up a bit because we have economists working on innovation, and then we have the practitioners who know how it really works, right? So I will start with the economists and talk a little bit about how we should think about sort of the economic effects of innovation, how we can foster it, and so forth, before we talk a bit more about the practical implementation, if that's okay. Daniel, I've introduced you as an old hand, sorry about that. But you have been around for a bit. And you do remember the Lisbon strategy. And it was not coordinated that I wanted to ask you about the Lisbon strategy anyway, but Clemens' first slide was so perfect that sort of, you know, our productivity exactly tailed off at the point where we implemented the Lisbon strategy. Now, was that causal? No, I'm joking. I have enough economics training to know it's not causal, right? But I still wanted to ask you about the Lisbon strategy. How did it came about at the time? Sort of what were the arguments then? What are the arguments now? And of course, crucially, sort of why has it not worked?
Yeah, many thanks for the introduction. I mean, I was for a long time persona non grata in many Commission and other circles after the Lisbon strategy, because I used to ask a simple question: show me any major reform that has come about because of the Lisbon strategy. And then it was usually embarrassed silence. Now, why did it come about? A bit, let's say, a bubble, right? A Euro bubble of the last years of the 1990s. Finally, monetary union came about. The internal market seemed to be progressing. So just more of the same, increase the dose. And the idea that somehow we heads of state, we sit together in Lisbon, fewer than now, and we will drive the economy forward. And that's, of course, the typical Sunday speech we had. They all said we want to have 3% of GDP. And then they went home and cut the budgets. I'm a bit exaggerating, but at least R&D, and these were boom times, right? R&D, the share of our public spending R&D actually fell slightly in most member countries. So there was no method behind it, nothing basically. If you allow me, I would, however, like to not so much focus on, let's say, the Lisbon strategy, but more on how do we link the first session and the present one. Because if you look back and you look at indicators like industrial production at current market prices, you take the US and the EU in 1999-2000, almost exactly the same. In current dollar, not percentage of GDP, just exactly the same, almost. 2022, again. Almost exactly the same number. So in terms of the old, right, the industry, I should have said manufacturing output, right? In terms of the manufacturing industry, Europe might not have done greatly, but not very differently from the US, right? So in that sense, there was no loss of competitiveness or loss of whatever productivity. Almost the entire difference that we observe now, especially over the last years, between the EU and the US is from what we call high tech, right? And essentially two sectors or three. It's software, it's the biggest, ICT, and biotech. These are the three sectors which make the difference between the EU and the US. And these are the three sectors which thrive on innovation. And if you allow me, then can tell you some of the things which I told you earlier, which is that these sectors are the ones in which we Europeans have been lagging in innovation effort for 20 years. So right now, perhaps you have in mind a little bit the figure that Clemens Fuest showed from our joint report. It's difficult to see because you have this blue thing for the US, which is large, and then this much smaller one for Europe. You didn't see the software part, right? Because it's very.
It was there, but it was. Yeah.
Right, and the ratio US to Europe is around 12 to 15 to 1 in terms of R&D effort.
Mm-hmm.
Today,
in software.
In software. Today, 10 years ago, and 20 years ago. So this comes from...
Well, it stays constant, 15 to 1.
15 to 1.
10 years ago, 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the European software sector has expanded nicely, right? But
right, but it started at a very low
right,
level.
and if you're 15 times smaller from a big sector, that matters. And I think that is the key issue, which also will come about, I think, in the security issue that you mentioned later. And that's what we should focus on. It doesn't mean that all the other stuff which we discussed at the first session, the single market and so on, should not be done. We can get a few percentage out of the old stuff, but we are absent in the new stuff.
Okay. Reinhilde, you've worked on sort of trying to measure innovation and comparing it to countries. Maybe we can take this a bit forward, what Daniel just said. Sort of, I know it's hard to measure innovation. We can measure R&D spending. We can measure patent output and so forth. How does Europe compare more broadly, even if you include China in this? Sort of, are we? Daniel just made the case on sort of these three sectors where Europe is quite far behind. Is that true across the board, also in other sectors, also compared to China, for example? Where does Europe stand in a more global context?
Yeah, so thanks for this question. So indeed, what we're able to measure is very important because that's something that we will be using also for policy. That will be the targets, the indicators, the KPIs, which we choose, what we can measure here. And that's why it's way more easy to measure the inputs. How much do we spend on research? How much do we spend on development here? And this is why, like we had in the Lisbon, the target was 3% purely on spending. And then then 1% public, 2% private here. And the public part, that's also more easy to measure, at least monitor whether we get there. And the 2% in the private sector, how we can leverage that is already a bit more difficult. That's a bit of a problem with KPIs, with targets, and with policy making built on these targets here is that we take what we can measure. But in the end, what really matters is that we need the innovation in order to drive the productivity growth that we will need in order to get to the objective that we want, decarbonization, that we want economic growth, and that we want strategic autonomy here. So that's basically what we actually should be measuring, and why we care about innovation, not about the inputs, but about what it delivers here. And that's a bit the problem also that Europe has. If you look at the numbers, if you look at the numbers, you look purely at input, and for instance, if you look at science, actually the Lisbon strategy did work because we did catch up in terms of science. That's again something we can measure. We can look at highly cited publications and stuff like that. And we caught up on that. Caught up relative to the US. And China, of course, is the big rising star there here. You can still argue that maybe on the high quality, we still have a bit of an advantage here. But still, overall, again, that's something we can measure. If we go one step further in terms of research, and then particularly the public spending on this, also there, we did, again, I think Lisbon strategy worked a bit, although very slow. But nevertheless, we're not that much running behind, so the gap with the US is not so big. You can, of course, argue that our public spending is too much fragmented here, and that's why it doesn't pay off. But in terms of absolute numbers or relative numbers to GDP, we're almost at the same level here. So that's again not a problem. Numbers for China are way more difficult to compare here. So I don't want to. So the problem is really in the private part, and that's exactly where we should be caring about, because in the end, whatever we do in terms of policy to support innovation, it should be picked up by investments by the private sector in using these new ideas and new technologies in order to create the growth and decarbonization strategic autonomy that we want to. And that's exactly where the problem is. So if you look at certainly already at the inputs, so the private sector, that's where we are really running behind the US. Again, China is a bit more difficult. What's public, what's private, right? I would then also argue that we need to look also beyond the aggregate to in which sectors actually. And I want to be a bit more careful than you in terms of, is it just a matter of an issue in software and in biotech? I think it's a way more general problem here in terms of the structure of our innovation system that's much less creative destruction, Schumpeterian, where we have not so much small new ideas that come from new players here that can grow to critical scale to challenge the incumbents here to be more innovative. That's why we missed the digital story here, and we continue to miss it. It's also in biotech and pharma also, because if you have a look at we have a lot of biotech, but they can never enough scale and challenge the incumbents here. Other sectors where we are strong, like for instance in cars, I think for the moment it's one of our strengths still, but also there we're missing a bit that creative destruction and if you look at the recent trends with Tesla and whatever, so also there we have not enough challenged incumbents here. So that's the issue we need to tackle for policy perspective.
Okay. Oliver, can I bring you in on the question of the sectoral disaggregation here? So we've heard a few sectors where Europe does well, chemicals and pharma, and some of them. What is common about these sectors where Europe still does relatively well? Is there any common element? Is there any common theme why Europe does well in those? And sort of conversely, of course, what is the common theme of those where Europe does not do well? Maybe you can start with that.
I think it's really important to understand the innovation system, how it looks in Europe, and this may explain a lot of these things we really observe. So on the one hand, we have these really great public research institutions where they do excellent research, but still they work in a very strict bureaucratic corset, so they are not really autonomous and so on. But the main problem is that therefore the transfer of knowledge into the economy doesn't really work. And that's the reason why we don't see many startups from scientists. So the BioNTech case, where a scientist from a university started a business, is a rare event in Europe. Simply, let's face it. When we look at private R&D takes place in incumbent companies that have been existed for decades, for even centuries. And they have made of the innovation process a kind of routinized process, a really plannable process where you come up continuously with improvements, but they are probably only incremental. But there's not so much room for really radical new. And that's probably the biggest problem. And that's the reason why we don't see, again, spin-offs out of these companies, where we don't see new joint ventures from these incumbent companies. So again, the ASML example. So it is a joint venture of Philips, which existed since the end of the 19th century. But again, a rare event. This is not something we typically see, and that's probably the overall problem. And let me come back to what Daniel said about software. So it is probably not so much the case that we can't develop software. So German automotive producers have hired tons of software developers, more than any other car producers around the world. Will they be successful? I don't know, because it's a very specific approach, how they approach these things. And we have completely missed the platform business model, which started in the 2000s, and which may explain these differences.
So the sectors where it still works relatively well are sort of where we've been around for 100 years in Europe, like pharma, where there's some kind of established connection between universities and firms, because if that connection already exists, maybe then it works, and where the progress is more sort of incremental in a sense.
Yeah,
okay.
where strong path dependencies still work.
All right. Yes, of course.
I think the sectors where Europe is strong almost always involve manipulating physical objects.
Okay. Okay, I didn't.
Yeah? Not pure code.
I see. And in the report that you published at IFO, Daniel, you talked about mid-tech and high-tech. I mean, the IFO Institute called the car industry the mid-tech industry. I mean, are you not worried about losing funding from Bavaria? No, I'm just wondering, sort of, how do we think about this distinction between mid-tech and high-tech? Because I think the point was, in mid-tech, Europe still does relatively well, whereas in high-tech, it increasingly struggles. So how do I I always thought that a car is relatively high-tech, but it's sort of, I don't have a car, so I don't actually know. Go ahead.
Now, a car might contain some high-tech elements, but as I said earlier, it's basically this physical thing, right, which has to be put together. I mean, there's two ways. The first is that if you look at the R&D intensity, although I know it's only an input, right, and we have a broader ecosystem problem, but if you look at the input intensity, then high-tech sectors typically have, let's say, 15 to 20% R&D investment as percent of sales, and all over the world, by the way. Our small software firms, like the US, almost everywhere, and pharma also, and automotive has between 4 and 5 all over the world. Okay. Right, and other sectors which we qualify as mid-tech.
Nice.
So it's not just that in Europe it's this way. You find a very narrow distribution of the R&D intensity across sectors in very different countries.
I see. Reinhilde, you wanted to come in on this as well. I have another question on horizontal technology, in a sense of technology that is sort of a basis for many other applications. And I mean, how should we think about Europe in these kinds of horizontal technologies? I mean, this seems to be, I mean, it's a different way to look at it, but I thought it was interesting that there are some aspects of, I mean, AI is a classic example, but there are others where the development of that basic technology can be then applied across a wide range of sectors.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because the obvious technology that classifies as a kind of platform technology is AI. And AI will indeed be very important, not just in general, but also for innovation in any kind of sector here, even including in pharma. It will be the applications of AI that will actually be a revolution in. And so we can not take for granted that we would keep our comparative advantage in whatever. So because AI is going to affect the innovative processes in almost all sectors here. And for what makes AI very strong is of course, we need to have the skills, and we are not too bad in terms of the AI, in terms of science. Here it's translating that into applications, like was also mentioned here. And that's where we still are in comparison with China and with the US. We miss the large scale of applications, and that's where the internal market is so important here. AI thrives on having large markets, large applications here, using your big data in an efficient way here. And so if we really want to, so it's not just only mastering the technology, it's also having the right kind of applications at a large scale here, and that's where Europe needs definitely also this internal market here. And I also want but maybe I should.
No. You wanted to disagree with Daniel. That's always my favorite, because
yes, like, and also with you.
Oh, thank you.
So in terms of pharma, that's one of our strength sectors here. Okay. I would want to be very careful on this here, because a lot of our first of all, we need the UK and Switzerland in order to be strong there here. And also, I mean, the reason why they are innovative, our companies, is because of the US market. It's there where they develop their drugs for here, and so it's still a lack of single market in Europe here. So if ever we want to worry about strategic autonomy, I'm not sure that this.
I mean, I wanted to be a bit positive and optimistic and say there are sectors in which we still excel.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, that didn't quite work then. Andreas, could I bring you in here, because you're basically tasked with bringing disruptive, groundbreaking innovation to a country that loves perfecting a machine for 100 years. So how's that going?
Well, we're a new kid on the block. We've only been around for 5 years. We were founded 5 years ago, and we became operational about 3 years ago. So the proof is still out, how successful we're going to be at that. But I think if we look back at what has been said already, I think, and the slightly pessimistic note at the very beginning of our conference today, with all the challenges out there, I think we also have a few assets in Europe, and one of the assets is definitely that we still have excellent basic research coming out of our research institutions. That's a big positive. Another thing, for example, is that not many people talk about, but we have a higher ratio of students in STEM subjects as compared to the US. That's another asset, definitely, because that's where the innovation is going to come from. So those are positives. We have a strong core of an industrial base in all over Europe. However, these are very often industrial players that date back to, at least in Germany, to what we call the Gründerzeit in the late 19th century, where the Siemens and the Bayers and the BASF were all founded around that time. And they were all, guess what? When they were founded, they were all startups, right? And then later they became the giants that they are today. The problem is that we're still living off of the returns of these companies many decades later, and it served us well, right? I mean, the welfare is fantastic. The yields are great. However, they're coming under pressure now. We can see that in the automotive, and we can see it in pharmaceuticals. Look at the case of Germany. There's, with the exception of Bayer, which is under enormous stress, there's hardly any pharmaceutical players left. Chemical industry is under pressure. So what we really need is the next big thing, and we're missing out on that all over Europe. But we're a federal agency in Germany, so we're looking at the German case mainly, and we're missing out on that. And that's because not a shortage of ideas. There are thousands of fantastic ideas everywhere coming out of the research institutions and elsewhere. But an idea is only of very limited value because we need to turn them into innovation. And for an idea to become innovation, or for an invention to become innovation, we've got to commercialize. And that's what we're not doing very well. You mentioned the case of BioNTech being an exception, and indeed it is an exception. We need a lot more of that coming out of the institutions. And so that's where we step in we fit in that puzzle, hopefully, as Sprint, where we want to help disruptive type of innovation to actually materialize. And now the question is, what's Sprunginnovation? What is that actually? What's disruptive versus, you mentioned, incremental innovation? And so sometimes a definition works very well if you say what you're not interested in, as opposed to what you're interested in. So if there's a proposal being brought to us that would make an existing product better, we're not interested, right? We're only interested if it's something totally new, de novo, with the potential not only for a new product and a new company. That's also not enough. We want the potential for an entire new market, a new industry. That's what we want to see. So pretty high goals.
Do you have any example that you can give us, sort of to give this a bit more color, sort of?
Yeah, sure. Let's. We just invested, just because it's most recent, not because it's the hottest thing we have. We have a lot of hot things, but it's the most recent. We put a lot of money into nuclear fusion. Totally new. I mean, in Germany, it's a special situation. We kind of ended everything when it comes to nuclear energy with the common technology. We think we have a very good position for fusion. But there's competing technological approaches, and we were just discussing this in the break. So as Sprint, we would never prescribe what kind of technology in nuclear fusion we want to foster. We would just put it out there that we want to fund new approaches in nuclear fusion, and they could be now competing approaches like magnetic fusion or laser-based fusion. We don't care, because we don't. If the top scientists don't know who's going to win the race, we are not going to have the hybris to say that we know. So we're going to fund them all if we think it makes sense. And one way of looking at it is that we will bet on the race and not on a single horse. Right.
I see. Okay, Keith, can I bring you in? You've worked quite a lot on EU research and innovation programs. I think why I started with the Lisbon strategy is because the idea that Europe wants to be a knowledge-based economy is quite old. But I sense a different sort of urgency. I don't want to call it panic yet, but, well, a little bit maybe. So do you sense that as well, that there's sort of a renewed urgency, because it's no longer just about sort of sustaining economic growth in an otherwise benign world, because yet now it's really about whether we are technologically dependent on others? Is there sort of a renewed sense of urgency, and crucially, of course, what follows from that urgency within the EU?
Yeah, no, I think there is. I think the diagnosis is much sharper than it was 20 years ago when we did Lisbon. I think there's been a huge shift towards thinking about disruptive innovation, because partially disagree with some of the comments so far. I think the problem is scaling up companies. We did have companies in all of these areas. They just didn't scale up. And I think Draghi report was very clear on that. If you look at the Lisbon strategy, I don't think you'll find the word startup anywhere. It was very much a model that and in the EU program, in the framework program, we were doing a lot of basic research with the ERC. We were doing a lot of industrial R&D. We had private partnerships in aeronautics and pharmaceuticals. We had nothing for startups and new ideas coming in and how you scale them up. And this is why, we are where we are. and not as advanced as we should be. So what we should not be doing is betting on the last set of technologies, such as software. We should be really looking at the future ones. So I do see a complete new urgency, a very much sharper diagnosis. And the other thing I see, which I think was maybe a bit missing in Lisbon, and I think Daniel hinted at this, is some very concrete ideas about how to make this happen. So the 28th regime for companies, if we can get that off the ground, looking at institutional investment, how you get that into venture capital. Venture capital is 5 times higher in the US. And I mean, it's a massive differential for the kinds of innovations we're talking about. Reforming public procurement rules, a new Innovation Act. I mean, it's much more solid and concrete of the reforms and the ideas. So I think there is a big sense of urgency, and that's good. There's a much sharper diagnosis, and there are some very solid ideas on the table about what should be done about it. I mean, Sprindi is good, and we have the European Innovation Council, which is also very new and is focused entirely on this problem. And partly to my surprise, I'm one of the people running it. It's been hugely successful in supporting startups and showing that you can shift investors into this. There is a lot of good stuff. I mean, we have about 3,000 startups across Europe applying each year. And we've been doing this for about 5 years. Every year, the quality of these startups is getting better and better. So, I mean, we see a big sort of change on the positive side about the startup ecosystem. But will any of these turn into big companies in the new technology areas? I think this is the big challenge.
Thank you. So I have an uncomfortable question maybe for the entire panelists. We are, if we are indeed sort of quite behind on some of the key technologies, and now, I mean, there are, positive developments in Germany, in the EU overall, in other countries as well. But the gap may be too large to the US and China in some sectors. Should Europe sort of focus on particular areas that it identifies as sort of technological areas where it needs to excel? Or should we sort of leave this out to the private sector, where to innovate? I mean, Europe cannot be sort of world-beating in everything, probably, right? Or are we still aiming to be sort of technological leaders in everything? You want to go first?
No.
No, okay. We can't. Or we shouldn't.
No, neither we should, because the world is very large, right? And neither can we. As I mentioned earlier, there are some sectors in which, high-tech sector, in which we at least are also runs. See, in software we are absent, right? But
what does that mean for software then? I mean, if we're absent, that means sort of the gap that we have to close is huge.
In the business to consumers, I think that business is gone, right? I mean, I don't think also we have very many startups here in Europe. So that's gone. But there are other areas where the economies of scale are not that large. And I think many of the startups at the EIC also are business-to-business software things, right? And without, let's say, that we are focusing on this, I think they will come naturally to the EIC, which I think is a good, very good, important thing to have, right? Which came 10 years after Lisbon, so it was not an outgrowth of the Lisbon. It was an outgrowth of the Lamy report after consecutive framework programs didn't really succeed very well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in pharma, we agree that we are behind and looking, but we are still present. It's not like in software, right? Aerospace and defense, I would also say we are still present because there you have to make things that work, complicated things, right? That's where Europe usually does well, right? And things which you do 10 times or 100 times. If you do things 1 million times, the Chinese will do it. Right? So I think these are the sectors where European industry has a chance. I don't think we really need to focus a lot, maybe a little bit. We can have some preference for this in some programs. But that's also where I expect our startups to come up. And then, okay, the effective public support we can discuss. Okay. But that's where I think things should go and will go naturally.
And does that, maybe Reinhilde, maybe can I ask you, does that depend our priorities also on who else is leading there? So for example, if we have strong allies like, I don't know, Japan, Australia, Canada, in the lead in these kind of technologies, then we are fine because we can depend on them. Whereas if the leader in the technology is China, then we may not want to depend on them.
Well, but actually, if we go really to the level of the very early stages of ideas, which is really still in the scientific and the very early basic research and development, it's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win. So we can still actually, and by working together with the strongest players outside and having enough absorptive capacity and being strong enough in these scientific skills, and I think we're still there, although we need to keep on investing in that, we can still be strong in these technologies, early stages here. But the problem is, can we then turn this into also innovative ideas that we can actually build competitiveness on? And that's still the European paradox that we're facing, and that requires more than just being able to get the funding, because which ideas will be funded? Those that have commercial value. And so for me, again, the conditions for having commercial valued ideas, and that's where the single market is so important here, a single open market here. And if we don't have that, we will always have a disadvantage. And whatever we create in terms of scientific ideas, and my positive side is that we still have that, but we still need to work on that scaling up here. But scaling up, I have to also be bit more careful in the sense that it's not that the incumbents are no longer important, the older ones here, and we need to all scale up. We need to have enough good ideas that are scalable, that either these startups can further exploit and attract funding here, but also could be incumbents taking over, acquiring these, because they still have important strengths here, like with the car manufacturing, they still have important advantages here, but they need to be challenged and contested here. So the scaling up is not only focusing on spin-offs, but also making sure that our incumbent innovative landscape also is willing to acquire these ideas here and find synergies.
Okay. Andreas, do you want to comment?
Yeah, definitely. I think what you're referring to very correctly is that we need a functioning ecosystem consisting of all players, the startups, the basic science, the startups, the incumbents, and of course the funding systems. And then hopefully also government support. However, your initial question, Christian, about, should we focus on specific technologies or fields? We at Sprint are extremely skeptical about that approach. I think public sector guidance, or let alone governmental guidance of which technological sectors we should be in, is a recipe for disaster. And I think it should be left up to the actual players on the ground. So we're agnostic to technology. You can hand in your idea. If you think you've developed something that is a disruptive innovation, you can hand it in 365 days a year, and we will evaluate immediately. We don't have any deadlines, twice a year or something like that. Every day is fine. And it can be anything, as long as it's really disruptive. And that's the challenge. Over 90% of the submissions we get are rejected because they are great innovations, however incremental. But I think what you said about the scaling up should really depend then on, what can we actually get funding for. And we're pretty good nowadays, after some trouble initially, we're pretty good at early stage seed funding and Series A maybe. But then we have that valley of death, where the companies, and I'm originally from the biopharmaceutical industry. The companies are, notoriously underfunded. They can't get the product ready to the market. They can't do their clinical trials. They can't get their first of a kind factories going. So it's a real problem, and that's where we lose so many great ideas. And that's where EIC has a role, where Sprint has a role, and then hopefully we can translate it to meaningful funding. And we're talking about tickets in Series B and Series C for deep tech, and 2-digit, 3-digit million tickets for nuclear fusion, easily 2, 3, 4, 500 million for one company, just for the scale up. And these amounts are not available in Europe, period.
Okay.
And so we're losing these companies in many different sectors because they're going to get their Series B in the States, or maybe in China, or maybe in the Emirates. right? And that's where they're going. And we've got to keep them here. That's why we have to provide the funding. And for that, we need capital market union. We need integration. We've got to find new types of funds that can actually provide this type of money. And we also need exit channels. That's where the incumbents come in. Our incumbents are not buying the startups. It's the American incumbents that are buying up. Out of the 10 largest acquirers of European deep tech startups, 6 are American. And it's the European incumbents that are putting their hands in their lap and they're not investing. And then we have the other, and I'm almost done on this thought, we have the other problem with the public markets. We have a patchwork of stock exchanges all over Europe. Not a single one of them is meaningful by international standards. And so we have no exit channels on the public markets. There's hardly anything going on with IPOs. Another big problem.
Yeah, I mean, Capital Markets Union was supposed to be sort of the glorious ending of this panel as the last one. No, it's fine. It's fine. It's all our favorite topic, so it's fine if you bring it up early. But we will come back to it because it is really important, and I want for us to discuss this a bit more. But Keith, can you come in also with maybe shedding a bit of light on not just sort of should we pick the technology, but should we pick the sector? I mean, there is a tendency in Europe to define all kinds of sectors as strategic, right? There's no sector that a French minister has not yet called strategic, right? Starting with yogurt. So the question is sort of what kind of sectors does the EU really need to excel in, or should we absolutely not give any guidance on which sectors we want to develop the technology in?
Yes, so strategic is in the eye of the beholder, right? So, no, I think there's a difference here. I think maybe at country level you do need to specialise, but I think at European level we really need capabilities. You never know where the next innovation is going to come from. I mean, you have areas like agriculture or construction that are super low tech at the moment, but we see some very, disruptive deep tech innovations in these sectors as well. So, I mean, what I find interesting is for the European Innovation Council, we don't really set priorities. We do the same. We say, come with your best ideas anytime. We'll look at them not based on which sector they're in, but based on, is this really a disruptive idea? Is it scalable? And is it high risk? And what you see from this is you don't end up with an equal distribution across all sectors. You end up with a quite kind of focused approach. So, for example, we have 24 startups in quantum. And we didn't start off saying we want 24 startups in quantum. We said we want the disruptive ideas. We'll look at them all. So you see, actually, and personally, I think that's the way to do it. You kind of don't set top down. You let the system work, but then you pick the ones which are really interesting, and that will kind of guide you. But at some point, you need to scale up seriously, and you need the whole ecosystem to work. So you take areas like, I don't know, sort of healthcare. If you want to synchronize the changes in healthcare systems with personalized medicine and synchronize how you regulate medical technologies with pharmaceuticals because they have to go together, you need a system approach, and that needs a top-down strategy. So I personally think you need both. You need the bottom-up bit where you follow the market, you follow the ideas, you back the winners, but at some point when you need system changes, you do need a top-down strategy to align all of the actors. Otherwise, I'm sort of skipping your question a little bit, but I hope that was
No, that's quite all right. But it's still the question: to what extent innovators in Europe seeing sort of the potential successes of their idea. So we are better in some than in others. There is an easier way to scale up maybe a biotech company because there are potential incumbents who could buy that startup and then scale it. Whereas if you have a great consumer-facing digital idea, the chances that you get the necessary funding in the European market are quite slim. So is it not that sort of the conditions that we have in Europe already sort of slightly pre-select where innovators are going into, or is there no mechanism like that in place?
No, I think that's right. I think it is. It's about the specific market you're addressing and how. But we shouldn't always say that we're fragmented and everybody else isn't. I mean, if I take the example of, we've got a few companies in drones, right? Europe is the only region in the world that has a regulatory framework where you can actually put onto the market a drone. And as a single market. So I also think we should be using the single market as a driver of innovation and creating the regulatory regimes, particularly for new technologies, where you don't have kind of legacy regulations in all of the member states. And then you can switch to the dynamic you were talking about, Christian. Actually, if you have a company here in Europe, it's relatively easy to scale across a single market compared to other regions which don't have that yet. I mean, drones is an interesting example where I think we've been first mover in creating a regulatory environment. But of course, there's many other areas where we're not first mover, and that's where you have the problem.
Okay. Reinhilde, just briefly, because I want to bring Oliver in.
Yeah, sorry. I really want to emphasize the importance of having an open, competitive single market here as an incentive for innovation. Here we talk a lot about access to finance, and of course the Capital Market Union is one of these here. But the reason, I mean, risk capital will only be coming if you have also an attractive, innovative idea, which means a large, open, innovative market for innovative ideas. So the single market for me and an open single market is very important here. And if we talk about, like, for instance, pharma, the reason why our startups go to the US or are bought up by US, it's also because we have a very fragmented market for access to medicine here. And as long as we don't have a single market...
That's all right. Oliver, can you come in also on the sectoral priorities or not? To what extent does it actually work if the public sector sets priorities? I mean, Andreas said it's sort of a recipe for disaster. Is that too strong?
The French are more in yogurt, so we prefer cruising ships. No, I would turn it a little bit different. So we should spend public research money mission-oriented so that it benefit societal goals and do it then technological open, which basically means, so if you think if our societal goal is to reduce our dependencies on imports, on raw materials from China, then we can do it in very different ways. So we can promote material research to find raw material that substitute critical material that we import from China. We could also do research on recycling and how to design, for example, products where we can easier separate these raw materials after the end of the product life. And what I would say is, so we should let these different approaches compete and spend, as long as we do it mission-oriented, we can basically do it technological open. And then there we do not have this debate about which technology, with which sector. So there are very different approaches and let them compete. And this is basically what you said, Andreas. And I have another answer, and it is international cooperation, which plays more and more role, I think. Let me give you an example. So we know in Europe how to produce industrial robots, because this is the art of our engineers. So this is one of these mid-technologies, by the way.
Really?
Yeah, it is. So it is really it is mechanics. It is mostly about mechanics. And these industrial robots, they operate in cages with no human-machine interaction, so no problem. What we are probably not so good in is producing the next generation smart robots that act in human-machine interaction. Why? Because you don't need only mechanics, where we are super good, but you also need sensors. Well, others are probably better. And you need AI, because you need somehow to recognize patterns in the sensor-generated data. And this is what we don't know. So why don't bring these competencies together? And this can be a huge advantage. But this gives us a completely different view on technological autonomy we discuss so often in Europe and many other countries.
I understand. Keith, can I ask you something, another maybe uncomfortable question? And this is sort of, if we have European research and innovation policy, and we want to be as open and sort of technological neutral and so forth, could we end up then regionally concentrating those funds in countries where, you know, the research base is stronger, but there's more potential for innovation and so forth? I mean, usually these kinds of programs then end up being sort of tweaked so that every region in Europe, I mean, that was in part because one of the founding causes of the EU was to create some kind of regional equity, right? So what is the mechanism in the EU research programs to both ensure sort of research and innovation excellence, and how do you marry that with sort of regional equity in Europe?
Okay, that's always our big fight every 7 years when we're doing this. But of course, this is going to be concentrated. I mean, you can't say that, you know, every region is going to be excellent at large language models. It doesn't make sense. And a lot of these technologies, you do need a geographical concentration of people, of assets, of infrastructure, of interactions. But then the question is, I mean, there's a lot of technologies, as we've discussed, and across Europe, how is this distributed? So what I think we're looking for is for regions to specialize in areas where they do have something which is a bit unique. And we're trying to get regions to think about this. I mean, the research program is geographically neutral. We pick the best projects. This is what we do in EIC as well. We have no geographical criteria at all. We just pick the best ideas, and they should be globally excellent ideas. But then the issue is how we work with structural funds that are putting a lot of resources, including now Next Generation EU. But a lot of this is also building up the infrastructure. And if you look at different technologies, some technologies you don't need much infrastructure, you just need people. Some technologies you need very expensive kit. We're funding a lot of this, so then you need people to go with the kit in the right places. So, I mean, there's a lot of areas which are really changing. I mean, if I take, I used to work for Carlos Moedas, who was the Portuguese commissioner. He's now mayor of Lisbon. Lisbon is completely transformed as an area for startups and bringing new companies. So we also see a lot of dynamism, and that's also good for the leading regions because they need to have competitors that are trying to outdo them to keep them on the global edge as well. So again, it's about balances, but I think we try to have one funding which is pure excellence and another about the building up the geographical capabilities, and the difficult thing is how we get them to interact.
Okay, so research programs like Horizon or so, they are geographically blind.
Yes.
And are they also geographically blind in practice?
Can I just add one data point, which is
okay.
If you look at the distribution of Horizon funding across countries, as a percent of GDP received, not per capita,
okay.
There's no correlation between income and the percentage received. So
okay, so it's a relatively equal distribution.
It's not, it's
no correlation. Okay,
no correlation all over the place.
All over the place,
right? But there's no evidence that systematically poorer countries get less.
Okay. Before we come to the Q&A, we will be asking for your questions in a minute, but I promised sort of a fantastic ending of this panel on the Capital Markets Union because we all love that topic. So the Capital Markets Union, I think, is sort of 10 years old. And, you know, over time, people have sort of given Capital Markets Union trying to give it new meaning because there was no real political impetus behind it, right? I feel, and maybe this is wrong, but I feel that it's a bit different now because people start to understand sort of why we need this, and suddenly it has a purpose. Maybe that is too optimistic, but the whole what Andreas already outlined is sort of the importance of capital markets and deep pools of funding for innovation. I think that is sort of trickling in. First of all, is that right? And second, what does that translate into then in terms of actual practical policy? Those would be my sort of two final questions before we get it to the Q&A. Andreas, you have already made a strong case of why that is needed. Maybe someone else on the panel can tell us more about sort of how you think Capital Markets Union, in combination with the impetus to innovate, can now drive this agenda. Reinhilde?
Yeah. So I guess we're talking about Capital Markets Union for innovation, right? So this definitely also entails a bit more risk capital aspects here. So we have on the one hand, the risk capital markets, and I think there it's important to not just only look at the capital side, but also the incentives for risk capital, venture capitalists to operate in Europe here. And that's why I think what makes it very complex also for risk capital, venture capitalists is the complexity of when they invest in new startups here. It really depends on in which country, where, and what kind of legislation. So there, I think that the 28 scheme for startups, I think, will be very important in order to reduce the cost of operating as a European-wide venture capitalist will be very important. So it's not just only the Capital Market Union, but also making sure you get the incentives right by other dimensions of the single market here. And then, of course, banking union is also important because also even banks are sponsoring innovation projects as well, not the early stages, but also still. So if we could also have our banking sector a bit more innovative, being willing to take more risk, using their big data that they have available and AI technologies in order to assess better the risk projects, the risk assessment of the innovative projects that they could fund, then we can also bring that part of the financing also. So I want to really draw it broader than just purely the capital market union here. In order for that to work, a lot of other barriers will actually need to be removed here. So it has to fit in a much broader single market agenda.
But that means sort of if you want to make progress, then you again have sort of a list of, I don't know, hundreds of policies that would need to change. And I mean, my experience from the Capital Markets Union debate is that we pick the low-hanging fruit and then the rest was sort of left because it's too difficult to do. And so the question is there anything in that Capital Markets Union agenda which has sort of a more immediate bang for the buck when it comes to innovation? Is there anything in there that is particularly important? You mentioned IPOs, for example. So,
so the 28 regime, I think.
28th regime, okay. Daniel.
I wanted some disagreement, so...
Disagreement with whom? With me?
With any.
That's fine, you can disagree with me.
I'm all for the Capital Markets Union, right? But the question is now for innovation. And you asked for a single measure.
It can be more than one, but it's sort of, it shouldn't be 100.
I take one.
Okay, cool.
Okay. And so I agree with Reinhilde and I presume everybody else on the panel that the key issue is for new company startup, you need more risk capital, equity, right? And that is the part which is not absent, which is very low in Europe, partially because our institutional investors pay a high price for doing so.
Pension funds.
Pension funds. So the simple measure would be to say pension funds, insurance companies are allowed to invest a certain percentage of their total assets in equity in general and venture capital in particular, without having to secure that with 100% capital. This was done in the US in the 70s and 80s, and many people date the beginning of the VC scene, the venture capital scene in the US to that innovation. Very simple measure, doesn't cost a lot, and strangely enough, I don't see it on any big capital union, capital market.
Well, why is that?
It's too simple.
No, come on. Okay, fair. Okay, maybe it's too simple. But there's also, you're messing with the pensions of people. Sorry, I'm pretending to be a politician now.
But you know, the argument then and now is 1 or 2%, that is not, won't kill them, right? So they can take these risks at the margin. And, sorry, everybody knows that in the long run, this will, with a very high likelihood, will pay off. So that's a risk worth taking. And also the second point is, take Switzerland. It's not in a capital markets union, right?
No.
but they have a very strong, vibrant biotechnology sector with capital and right. So, as I said, I'm all for the capital markets union, but I don't want to wait for it to transform the European innovation scene.
Okay. All right. There we are with your questions for the last 15 minutes or so. So raise your hands, ask the most challenging question you always wanted to ask them. We have the first one over there. I will collect a few questions and then they can pick those that they want to answer. Could you wait for the microphone and please tell us your name and your affiliation?
Yeah, Julio Saavedra from IFO and LMU. What about immigration? When we're talking about innovation, you need to attract talent. And with the atmosphere in the European Union and other places against immigrants, think about all the talented Indians, for example, that could be attracted to come to innovate in Europe. Or if you look at the people behind some patents in the United States, you see a whole range of Indian and Chinese names. Aren't we wasting an opportunity there?
I would think the answer is almost definitely yes, but I will wait for the panel to elaborate. Are there any other questions? Did I not see a hand go up here in the corner? No, Florian. The microphone just over here in the middle. He can also speak in two microphones.
Yeah, I want to come back to the Lisbon strategy at the beginning. So
thank you. Yes. I'm not the only one.
Because a Lisbon strategy was that we would like to spend 3% of our GDP into R&D. We are now at the number of about 2.3% in Europe. Some big economies are just about 1 or 1.5. Some others are at 3. And you already said it's not because of public investment. It's because our private sector does not invest in R&D so much. So what is a strategy to raise it in quantity and quality, what we discussed? So we have some strategies, but what is the incentive for our private sector to invest more in R&D?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Can I just add one more question on this, which is sort of my slight obsession with SMEs and the politicians' obsession with SMEs? Because we all know that sort of when it's about innovation and policymakers design policies, then they have to mention SMEs. They have to make sure that SMEs are mentioned in sort of fostering that kind of innovation. We also know that among SMEs, for example, that it's only really the big SMEs that are innovative, if you take startups out of this, right? So is sort of our obsession with SMEs also hindering us to focus on sort of the big ticket innovation, and sort of related to his question, sort of is in part the problem that we have companies that may want to innovate, but they're just too small and they cannot cover up the necessary funding for that kind of investment. There was a fourth question. Let us take that as well, and then we can pick. Yes. Can you state your name and affiliation?
Thank you very much for the word. My name is David Brechlik and I'm from Raiffeisen Bank International, and I would like to ask that we are talking about the harmonization of regulatory framework all over the European Union, but we have to remember that there are still 27 states, and we have seen the production and productivity growth before the Lisbon, and after the Lisbon, the decline of that. So probably before that there was less harmonization, and now there is more harmonization. But before that there was a competition between the states in the regulation, maybe in the legislative. So maybe it attracted and made the innovation and the innovative companies to grow easier in one country, but then it spread it to another countries. So is this in your, let's say, mind and in your brain and idea field, and can you reflect on that?
Thank you very much. So we had immigration and funding and SMEs, and whether the competition between 27 different states fosters innovation. Oliver, do you want to kick us off with a? You can pick. You don't have to answer all of them, because then we would run and eat into the next panel. So maybe pick two.
I start with SMEs, and this has a little bit to do with also the question how we should how we can support public R&D spending. So supporting startups or small and medium-sized enterprises is definitely an issue, because when you look at all these funding lines, it is often by far too difficult to apply for small and medium-sized enterprises to apply for these funds, because the whole procedure is by far too difficult. So there is a specialized consulting industry that then starts doing these applications, which is really ridiculous. And by the way, then in 2020, for example, we introduced an R&D tax credit to make access to funds for SMEs easier. But now we have a two-step procedure to apply for these tax credits, which basically means that there's a new consulting industry for small and medium-sized enterprises to apply for these tax credits. So that's really, really problematic. So you have to make these application processes by far easier, and their small and medium-sized enterprises would benefit. And that's an easy way to do it, I think. You could also, like it is done in the US, in these different funding lines, you could simply earmark a certain proportion of the funds for startups and small and medium-sized enterprises. Because what we see is that once you have applied for funds, you will be successful in the next funding round. It's a kind of experience things, or I don't know what. And to break this up would be a simple way to earmark a certain amount of money of these funding lines for new applicants, small and medium-sized enterprises, and so on. However you want to do it. That's one argument. The other argument I want to do. One reason why we also want to support these small and medium-sized enterprises, we often like to call them the hidden champions in Germany. They are successful in niches, but they are hidden, and they will stay hidden. They will stay small. That's for true, because their business model typically doesn't allow for economies of scale, for large economies of scale. So they will stay small, they will stay in their niches, but they have one big advantage. This routinized innovation process in these firms does not rely so much on knowledge spillovers. Therefore, these companies can be spread around the country. And you see economic activity and well-paid job around the country. And this is not so true for these super innovative high-tech firms that very strong rely on knowledge spillovers, because they are all concentrated in the big agglomerations. And that's what you see in the US. You see the economic activity in these few spots, and the rest is somewhat disappeared.
Okay, thank you. Keith.
Right. So I get to pick the easy ones as well now. So
well, pick a challenging one.
Yeah. No, I wanted to comment on SMEs as well, because I think the problem here is there's just such a diversity of companies under the SME label. I mean, in the EIC, our average company is 10 to 20 employees and a few years old. I mean, that's completely different from a company that's well established with 200 employees. And so I think the issue is that we do need to, and what we're starting to do, although we don't have a definition, is to say actually startups are very different from SMEs. They are, by definition, SMEs. They fall within the SME category. But it's a very different set of policies, set of circumstances, as Oliver was saying as well. I think we have a real problem with consultants who actually, it's in their interest to make out that all of these programs are super complex and we won't get there without consultants. So we're making them a lot simpler, but this is not the message that the consultants want to pass on. And then I think that links to the private R&D question, because if you look at the differential on private R&D, it's about new companies that have scaled up in the US. I mean, how much of this private R&D is coming from the Magnificent Seven? If we had the Magnificent Seven in Europe, the statistics would be completely different. So I think this is also a lot of the explanation about why we're missing out on private R&D. And then something that I think is interesting about the 28th regime is it is a bit of, if it works, it's giving companies options. They go for the national regime, they go for the European regime. And I think if we do our job well, when we design a 28th regime, it has to be at least as good as any of the national regimes to really have something that works at the European level. And not only that, it needs to be at least as good as the Delaware corporate structure for investors as well. So we have a European Delaware as well. So I think it is kind of useful to be looking around at what is the best regulatory answers both across Europe and across the world, and then putting those into European legislation.
Andreas,
I'd like to add to that, and then I'll try to tackle immigration.
Thank you.
I think from our strategy is very similar. At Sprint, we don't want to crowd out private investment in R&D. We want to crowd it in. Mm-hmm. And so we want to provide incentives for doing so. But the problem is what we heard in the prior panel is also related to market capitalization. And if you realize that the Magnificent Seven, each one of them has a higher market capitalization than the entire German DAX index, right? So Microsoft, Apple, NVIDIA, higher valuation than the entire 40 companies in the DAX. That gives them, of course, a lot of ammunition to do R&D, and it gives them ammunition to buy tons of startups that our European incumbents are not buying. And that's a way of how we could get higher investments in R&D or expenses if they're not capitalized. Anyway, the crowding in is what we need to try with public funds. With immigration, I think I know what a loaded question it is in Europe and the United States right now politically. However, if you look at the simple facts, the demographics are what they are. If we have a birth rate of 1.3, and we have to have 2.1 to stabilize our demographics in Europe. And if we want to keep the standard of living, we want to keep the welfare, we're going to need immigration. And we're talking here about innovation policy. So I'm not talking now about the low wage sector. I'm talking about the innovation and high tech sector, which is a different type of immigration. And I think we're doing actually very well in Europe. Germany now, I just saw the last rankings. Germany now is the number 2 country in the world for foreign students coming as degree-seeking students. That is phenomenal. We've never been up there in recent decades, despite the fact that we're a non-English-speaking country. That's sensational. Only U.S. is still higher. It used to be all the other English language countries above, but not anymore. And I think this is a wonderful way for skilled labor immigration getting into Europe, the bright and the ambitious young people, and getting them in for degree-seeking students, ideally in the STEM fields, and the success rate is great. Look at the awesome track record of the Technical University of Munich. They have greater than 25% foreign students in all their programs, and many other high-tech universities have the same. Mm-hmm. And this is the type of immigration that could really help us on the innovation front.
Okay, thank you, Reinhilde.
Yeah, I also have to choose.
Yes, you have to. I'm afraid we have to. We have to.
So maybe I take the last one because nobody has actually answered this one here. So with the Lisbon agenda, are we missing the previous competition we had for regulation? Is that something that could actually have been good for productivity growth? Right, if I understand your question. Well, I think as economists we agree that competition is always good for innovation. We have the escape the competition story of Philippe and others here, because that's really the incentive also that innovators actually need to have their good ideas, differentiating them from others here. But on the other hand, and at the same time, these good ideas then need to be able to sell on a larger markets here. And so this fragmentation might increase more local competition and escape the competition, but still we need integrated large open markets in order for these ideas that might be initiated like that, then also to be able to exploit here. So sorry, but it doesn't work according to my ideas on that. So now I'm wondering whether I should do immigration or SMEs. Okay, let me do the SMEs.
Go ahead. Go ahead on immigration.
Okay. Okay. So on immigration, I'd like to, I also indeed, access to skills is something that innovators very often indicate as the motive of what is impeding them to innovate here, and particularly like access to digital kind of skills here. So, and that's why we also need to look for open markets for skills in order to address that barrier here. But that's not enough only in terms of attracting students here. Then we also need to make sure that we keep these students here and that they're able to also develop their ideas in the market, and not only them, but also their family too here, because otherwise they still will be restricted here. Another dimension we should also be looking at for immigration is immigration, certainly for us, comes very often from like Africa. But also, I think we should also, there's lots of stuff going on in terms of innovation activities in Africa here too. So creating also the right incentives for people that they can actually develop good ideas also in Africa will also help actually to have a much more immigration system that we could handle too. And then finally, in terms of SMEs, no, okay. I cannot.
Well,
okay, no.
Okay, Daniel's time on SMEs. You go ahead.
No, I want to hear what Daniel
go ahead.
Okay, so for SMEs, and it's just a bit in line with what has been said before, is for me what I care about is that we have companies that can grow to the scale that they need in order to be efficient. That's the thing. Is this SMEs? Is this large firms? It's a scale at which they can be efficient, and that can be small scale, but they need to be efficient here, and they need to have the capacity to constantly absorb the technologies that they need in order to be efficient. But there is a tendency to economies of scale becoming more important here. So that's why if we stick too much on SMEs that cannot grow to the scale that they need in order to compete effectively, then we're done. So SMEs is a bit of a fetish. It's efficient scale.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll do it like in ice hockey now. The goalie stays and the outfield players switch, and we get 5 new ones. But please, for a big round of applause for this panel on innovation. Thank you so much.